never used to regard myself so much as a politician, but more as a projectile discharged from the Welsh valleys. When I listened to the cacophony of voices trying to intimidate me, I closed my eyes and listened to the silent voices of the poor. It may seem strange to start this story concerning Aneurin Bevan on these hills some miles north of the town in which he was born. And yet, these rolling moorlands above the Crownland Valley played a very important part in Bevan's formative years and indeed became associated with his death. Here on these hills, he would walk and talk with like-minded friends, discussing the social, political, economic problems of the day, dismissing the communism which was then beginning to sweep through the South Wales valleys, believing instead that only socialism could offer the way ahead, the new world that he so desired. Sometimes he would come up on these hills alone and stand declaiming to puzzled sheep and ponies, because Bevan suffered from a speech impediment. Indeed, he stuttered badly. And it was only because of this constant practice and effort that he overcame this problem and developed those skills that made him such a wonderful orator from Wayne Pound to Westminster. Yet Bevan would never see one dream fulfilled, and that was to build a short stretch of road connecting Trevel behind us with this ridge leading down into Talabont and the glorious Usk Valley. He saw this as a way by which Tredegar people could escape from their scarred industrial landscape into the beautiful rural districts beyond. Even so, these hills north of Trevel have long acted as a lung, a green space for Tredegar people who still come here to walk, to cycle, to picnic, and sometimes to pick whimberries. If Aneurin Bevan's spirit walks anywhere, it's on these Breconshire hills, in another county, in another world, but never far from the town that moulded him. Bevan had the gift of being able to impress many of those with whom he came in contact, whether they were family members or friends.
I remember walking with Uncle and I on our own through Duke's Meadow, which was just fields, no houses just then, and telling him, and I was nervous at doing this, Uncle and I failed my 11 plus. And he was so kind. He put his arm around my shoulder, gave me a toffee and said, "Never mind, my dear. When one door closes, another opens. Just make sure that you're there when the occasion arises." It was good advice.
I was a boy growing up. I was about 6 or 7 years old, and Mr. Bevan had 3 sons who were about my age, or at least the oldest one was my age. His name was Alwyn. And he used to park his van outside the front here and all that, and one day Alwyn and I were playing around the post office there and playing games and that, and Alwyn suggested that we have a little prank and climb into the back of the van, you know, the empty van, you know. So we thought, oh, well, it'd be all right. We'd go in there for a couple of minutes, you know, and all that. So we got into the van, and very shortly, somebody sat in the driving seat, and then a passenger got in and sat in the next seat, and off we went, and we were in the back. And we were a bit too scared to say anything at the moment, you know. We thought we'd keep quiet, like, you know, so we thought, oh, we won't go far, we'd probably take them around the block or something like that, you know. And so anyhow, we went on, and it must have been about 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, and we were getting impatient, and we started talking to each other, whispering to each other and all that sort. And all of a sudden the chap in the passenger seat, he said, "Bill," he said, "I think we've got a couple of spooks in the back," he said. And they didn't stop. They went on for about 2 or 3 minutes, I suppose, and then they stopped. And the passenger came around to the back, opened the van, and there we were. And I only knew him then as Uncle Nye, but it was Aneurin Bevan, you know. And they had stopped at a place, and it turned out to be Rugby. And we were outside a school where apparently Aneurin Bevan was going to speak to his constituents. And there we were. We had fouled things up a bit, like, you know. So they got us out of the van, and they weren't angry at all. They gave us some sweets and put us on a red and white bus, which then came up from Bargoed and passed our front door, and the driver set us off at the front door, and that was the end of the adventure.
Aneurin Bevan was a wonderful orator, and he had a pronounced stammer, but he used to go to quiet parts of the town and read out something to try and cure his stammer. And my late wife had hill rights upon travel, and one day she was rounding up sheep, and she could hear this shouting, and she said, "Oh, this is going to disturb the sheep. I wonder what this is." And she could car on the side of the road, and she looked down, and there was Aneurin Bevan sat there reading a book out loud to try and cure his stammer. But often in his speeches, he used his stammer to effect, and that made it more personal.
As soon as the man spoke, there was a hush went over the whole crowd, because he was a big man, and he had this aura of power about him. But as soon as he opened his mouth to speak, you had this sort of strange, lilting Welsh accent that came through, and it was compelling. It was compelling. You could hear a pin drop. Everything would go quiet until he finished, and then everybody broke into raptures. Yeah, that'll stay with me for the rest of my life.
I still hear stories about him. Earlier this year, our friend George Alsop was celebrating his 90th birthday. And at his party, he recalled an occasion in 1934 when Nye was guest speaker at Ebervale Grammar School prize giving. And George, 75 years later, remembered what Nye had said. He said, "When you boys and girls grow up, I want you to be able to feel that you can walk on the carpets of Buckingham Palace and feel as good with yourselves as anyone else there." And that's been George's mantra for 75 years.
Aneurin Bevan, born 15th November 1897 at 32 Charles Street, Tredegar, would be fortunate to survive his childhood. 3 of his 9 brothers and sisters did not. It was a period of bitter confrontation between coal owners and colliers, when men could be dismissed almost at whim, and being unemployed, sick or injured meant poverty and even the dreaded workhouse. Underground accident, injury and death were commonplace, and few weeks would pass without some victim's funeral cortege slowly making its way to local cemeteries. Rickets and tuberculosis were rife. TB killed thousands throughout Wales. Poorly lit underground working conditions caused nystagmus. Miners crippled by accident or roof fall were frequent, as were breathing difficulties caused by pneumoconiosis or emphysema. The former consensus between master and man had vanished. Now managers were answerable to remote shareholders who demanded the highest returns at lowest cost. Confrontation became frequent, especially after 1902 when the Miners' Federation, the Fed, was formed, and 6 years later it linked with the developing Labour Party. During his early years, Aneurin Bevan lived through several damaging strikes. Growing up in such a charged and confrontational atmosphere helped make him both politically aware and militant. Aneurin Bevan was born at 32 Charles Street, Tredegar, somewhere near this place. His father, David, a Welshman, was a collier. His mother, Phoebe, was English. They had 10 children, 3 of whom died young. It was a family that was radical in its political views and also nonconformist in its religious beliefs. They attended Carmel Chapel in Scurva, and it is possible that the fiery nonconformist sermons of that time and the heated discussions that followed affected the growing boy. The young Bevan attended Sahawi Elementary School. He hated school, particularly its headmaster, Mr. Orchard, whose mockery of Bevan's innate stammer helped to make that stammer worse. The typical classroom of that period had the teacher's desk somewhere near the fire, while those desks farthest away from its heat would have their inkwells freeze in winter. There would have been a map of the British Empire somewhere on the wall with its territories marked in red. There were a few tattered textbooks maybe, very little children's work ever on display, and they would have sat at desks that were hard and uncomfortable, the tops of the desks probably carved with the names of boys who had long since gone to work underground, or girls whose experience in life would have been equally arduous. Bevan would leave school hardly educated, and yet within a few years had virtually taught himself to read, especially from the comics, those wonderful, well-written books of the period with tales of imperial daring-do and adventures and of public schools of a sort that boys like he could never have attended. This man who became a world politician, who became a lover of music, art and history, he taught himself to read and educated himself at Tredegar Workman's Institute Library.
The Workman's Hall, I remember it because my father, he was he was a teetotaler, he was a smoker, but he was an ardent draft player, and he did captain the Tredegar Workman's Hall draft team. I remember having to write the programme cards out, the team cards out, before they played a match and all that, and I went with them a couple of times to Abertillery and Llanilleth and those places. And of course, the library, where Aneurin Bevan claimed was his university. It was a great library. To me, they did something which was really a start of something. They not only created a library for books, they started to collect paintings. And being an interest in painting, like, you know, I was very pleased with that.
I started school about 1933, and we went to Earl Street. There were no mixed classes, it was segregated from the start. School life there was enjoyable. We didn't think much of it. As a matter of fact, though, they did give me a watch for going to school for 5 years without missing, which was true. We had some wonderful teachers and we had some sadistic teachers.
Most of us, I think, were wearing daps. You know, we didn't have boots or shoes, like, you know. And every so often we'd be given a free pair of boots or something, like, you know, to help us on, like, you know. So I remember going to school and coming home with a pair of boots wrapped around my neck, sort of thing, like, you know.
But one of the two finest teachers there were Idris Thomas and Trevor Hamer. Idris was so conscientious that when he retired, he couldn't go uptown because it would take too long. All his former students would be pleased to go to him. And the interesting thing about Idris Thomas, a certain pupil would never turn up for football on a Saturday. And Idris knew he had potential, so he went and saw his mother. And his mother said, "Mr. Thomas, it's like this. I've got a sick husband, like a load of children. I can't afford to buy him boots. You send him up on Saturday, and I will see that he gets boots." Now, Idris either borrowed them or bought them, and that man turned out to be a damn good footballer.
Yeah, quite good days really. And of course there used to be tips all around us, you know, and I know there was one big tip outside the school, you know, where we used to play cricket, like, you know, and of course we'd hit the ball up the tip and run, like, you know, and know that nobody could go up and get it, like, you know.
Bevan's school days ended when he was 14, and he began getting up with his father to eat the breakfast his mother had prepared and walk to the colliery. Later he would write, "The knocker-up calls him from his bed at 4:30. He makes his way to the pithead. The streets are full of shadows with white faces and black-rimmed sunken eyes. The cold morning echoes with the ring of hobnailed boots." Yet, unlike others, Bevan would eventually break free from an existence that for many ended either from dust or old age, or when they were carried home maimed, mutilated, or dead. Later, as a union representative, he fought hard against all abuses, whether industrial or social. He would become Miners' Lodge chairman and surface checkweigher, and soon those in authority knew him as that bloody nuisance Bevan. Confrontation was increasing throughout the coalfield, and Bevan's campaign to improve working and social conditions had begun. It seemed that unless something was done, this coalfield might erupt. For working-class families like the Bevans, illness and disease were constant threats. At best, they could prevent a man working, at worst, kill the family wage earner, as had happened some years earlier when cholera twice struck the town. Tredegar's Cholera Cemetery, high on the hill between Rugby and Sahari valleys, is one of the really sad places of this area. It marks the terrible disease that struck this town in the 1830s and the 1840s, and it's typical of the diseases to which these mining valleys, these industrial communities were subject. And one of the reasons, indeed, indirectly, for the setting up of the Tredegar Medical Aid Society. Chapel cemeteries in the town were closed because there was a belief the disease was spread by some miasma rising from the graves. So this graveyard was opened up on the hillside from where it was believed the winds would blow this foul, whatever it was, this stench or this disease away. Interestingly, British regiments in India, when struck with cholera, would march upwind until the number of cases diminished and then finally ceased. So for organisations such as the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, diseases like this were always in the backs of their minds. But the deaths caused by cholera and other diseases were as nothing when compared with those suffered even by this small town during the 1914-18 Great War. When the Great War with Germany broke out in 1914, for the next 4 years, Tredegar and other coalfield towns prospered greatly. Wages had risen and continued to rise throughout the war. The war itself was supported throughout the whole of Wales, especially after 1916, when Welshman David Lloyd George became Prime Minister. That year, conscription came in. And when Aneurin Bevan received his call-up papers, it is said that his sister threw them on the fire to destroy them. Bevan was arrested, then released, and then went to a local doctor who diagnosed that he was suffering from nystagmus, the collier's disease caused by underground working conditions. And as a result, Bevan did not have to serve. This was held against him not only at the time, but later on even by socialist colleagues, that he'd become a conscientious objector. Later Bevan would say, "I am not and never will be a conscientious objector. I will choose my own enemy and my own battlefield. I will not have you do it for me. And yet at the time when the country's needs were desperate, that did not go down very well indeed. But the town was doing well. The coalfield had been nationalised temporarily for wartime. The future looked good. But in fact, when 1918 arrived, there would be depression, hunger and problems. It's an intriguing thought that if Aneurin Bevan had served and had been killed in Flanders, and his name was on Tredegar's war memorial, perhaps the National Health Service as we know it might never have come to fruition. Yet Tredegar experienced a remarkable wartime prosperity, and in spite of some shortages was still able to enjoy its Whit Monday chapel parades. This amazing footage of 1918, taken a few months before the Great War ended, shows a town packed with people all watching the chapels march by, each proudly following its banner. Many would have bought a new outfit for the occasion, often the only time in a 12-month when money was spent on clothes. Each chapel sang as they went, doing their best to impress onlookers with the number, discipline and quality of its turnout, as well as its choral abilities. The town would fill with voices raised in song as firstly they made their way to a beautiful and well cared for WWII Park, before returning up Morgan Street to various chapels where children would feast on lemonade and cake before, full and contented, playing games in some convenient field. 1918, it seems, was a year of great excitement for the town, when a British Army tank was used to encourage donations that would help provide more for the Flanders battlefields. Even so, the large and well-dressed crowd pressing around appears more fascinated by this amazing weaponry than the speaker's flamboyant urgings. Significant is the fact that, at a time of heavy military casualties, only one soldier in uniform is seen, all other men probably being connected with the coal industry or otherwise protected from call-up. But Tredegar men did die in the war, and civilian morale had to be maintained. The Olympia Cinema, formerly the Market Hall and now a public house, played an important role in this, its jostling customers then easily controlled by large policemen whose word was literally law. Even baby shows helped raise spirits. In spite of pouring rain, this parade of decorated prams, all in red, white and blue it is to be assumed, rolled through WWII Park, demonstrating both the mother's ingenuity and a pride in being British during a dreadful war. Interestingly, this is the only occasion when poorly clad children would be seen in the crowd. Wartime prosperity soon gave way to peacetime depression, but the hardships suffered locally during that period helped develop the town's medical aid service. From its earliest days, the Tredegar-Birthplace Company had appointed a doctor to look after its work people. By 1873, this had become a worker-financed organisation still under the company. But by 1890, this had evolved into the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, whose headquarters I'm now in. And it was in this room that Walter Conway was probably appointed secretary in 1915. And under the aegis of Walter Conway, under his direction and leadership, this Tredegar Medical Aid Society became one of the leading such societies in the country. A wonderful organisation providing doctors, nurses, surgeries, hospitals, everything you could think of that was necessary for the well-being of the town medically at that time.
Or my memories of the medical aid are of an exceptionally great organisation. When you think what these workmen did, uneducated workmen, but my word, they really built up this medical aid society. And when you think that we had a health service in Tredegar long before the National Health Service, we could get our medicines, appliances, we had our own hospital. If someone was needed to be sent, for example, to Bristol or even London, to the larger hospitals, that is all paid for by the medical aid. They didn't put their hands in their pockets, the workmen, for anything. It was all done by the medical aid, and as well as that, of course, they were looking at other things because the children could get cod liver oil and malt, which meant that they were also looking at perhaps social medicine. They were looking further than just the hospital and workmen being injured. They were looking for building up the children, giving them a medical start in life. Oh, it is a wonderful organisation.
It was probably in this room, in these very offices, that A.J. Cronin was appointed doctor here in about 1922. He came here and he lived here for 3 years, and Cronin wrote his wonderful book which describes, strangely, the Tredegar Medical Aid Society in those years. And his book, based around Aberallo, which was his name for the town of Tredegar, he used local characters. He used Dr. Davis, who was the Tredegar surgeon, as Dr. Llewellyn, who appeared in the book. So close a representation, I may say, that Davis threatened to sue. And he also used Walter Conway in it, very clearly indeed, but he describes him as Mr. Evans. And he describes in his book, he says about the people of the town, he says, they were a kindly people. Their enjoyments were simple and were found in their own homes, in the chapel halls or the rugby football ground at the top of the town. Their prevailing passion was a love of music. Cronin had the greatest respect for Walter Conway. And in his book, he uses him and describes him as, he says, Andrew, that is the character within the book, who is actually Cronin himself. Andrew could see that Owen's whole life was dedicated to improving the lot of the men. He wanted more than mere medical services. He wanted better housing, better sanitation. He quoted the maternity mortality rate amongst miners' wives, the infant mortality rate. He had all the figures, all the facts at his finger ends. It's interesting to think that it was possibly in this very room that Cronin was appointed, that maybe before that Walter Conway was appointed, and when Cronin was appointed here, it may have been that Aneurin Bevan was on the actual committee that did the appointment. It was this organisation, the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, that so influenced Bevan and thus indirectly influenced the establishment of Britain's National Health Service in 1948. And it's an interesting thought that before the medical aid took this place over, it was an organ shop. Tredegar must have been a very musical town. The only piece of original furniture that appears remaining in this building are the pigeonholes behind me, which Walter Conway certainly must have used, and Aneurin Bevan certainly would have known and seen. The location of the Tredegar Workmen's Medical Aid Society is in Tredegar Circle, and just outside, of course, is the town clock, around which are the plaques recording Aneurin Bevan's life and his great achievements. And just behind that again, of course, is the town hall, from whose balcony the announcements were made of Bevan's elections to Parliament through all the years he represented this constituency. For 3 years, Cronin lived at the Glen, near Poplar Road Chapel, a house clearly described in his novel. When A.J. Cronin came here as a young doctor in 1923 with his young bride, he was coming into a mining town, a valleys town, working for the Tredegar Medical Aid Society. And the society had built a house, the house behind me, which is called the Glen. And in this house for 3 years, Cronin was extremely happy. Indeed, his son Vincent was born here. It was conveniently located on the side of the valley because it was a short walk up to the terraces on Georgetown Hill where many of his patients lived, and also an easy walk down to his surgery in Park Place. The Central Surgery, of course, built by the Medical Aid Society, was a very important building. It had doctors' accommodation above, it had surgeries below, And when we came here to visit a doctor in those days before appointments, of course, it was somewhere you looked in through the door and your heart sank, because when every bench was filled with people, you knew you were going to be here for about an hour waiting to see your own particular doctor. And that wasn't all. When you went to see him and came out with your prescription, you had to wait at a queue at a little hole in the wall to receive your medicines. Now, of course, a care home for the elderly, this building remains one of Tredegar's great monuments to its medical aid service. The Citadel also clearly described local characters. One was Tredegar's surgeon, Dr. Davis, who lived in a large house at the end of Church Street and drove a massive American car. Tredegar Medical Aid Society helped inspire the National Health Service. Yet, little credit has been given to the Tredegar Company that truly initiated the scheme, or Walter Conway, whose inspirational work raised it to such high standards. Tredegar Hospital was built in 1904 on land given to the town by the Viscount Lord Tredegar. It was largely financed by the Tredegar Iron and Coal Company, and yet the colliers themselves were expected to pay 1/2 penny, 1 old halfpenny, in order to support this place. It was a wonderful hospital. It was very well equipped, and 20 years later, the hospital was then provided with a new wing and also with an operating theatre, again largely financed by the Tredegar Company. Dr. Davis was the great surgeon of this area. He was a celebrated man, and he was the one who features in A.J. Cronin's wonderful book about this town and about other places entitled The Citadel. Cronin's Citadel has Dr. Davis as Dr. Llewellyn, and really, although Cronin had a great deal of respect for the man as a surgeon, he was rather concerned that he, as an ordinary GP, wasn't allowed into the hospital to see his own patients. This was Dr. Davis's province, and no one else would interfere. So this great hospital was a very, very important part of the health service of this town, of the medical aid of this town. These plaques on the wall behind me, the one commemorating the Right Honourable Geoffrey Charles Viscount Tredegar, the donor of the site of this hospital. Very, very important gift to the town. He died in 1913. And then above that, on the right-hand side, is another one which says, "This tablet has been erected by the General Committee as a mark of esteem and appreciation of the surgical skill of E.T.H. Davis, Esquire, M.D., M.S., F.R.C.S., June 1924. This very, very important man who did so much for the good and the health of the town.
Well, of course, the medical aid had 2 surgeries in the town. We call them the top surgery and the bottom surgery. The doctors that certainly I attended were in the bottom surgery. And of course, the bottom surgery had lots of lovely, shiny wooden benches. And as you queued to see the doctor, you slid along the bench, so they were very highly polished. They had their own pharmacy there, and you got your medicine straight away as soon as you came from the doctor.
Yeah, we used to go to the top surgery, you know, and we had Dr. Zanazzi and Dr. Sutherland, and of course Dr. Wheeler later, like, you know, and it was always a bit disheartening to go in there because there'd be a a large crowd on several seats, you know, which you'd sit on the end seat and gradually you'd slide along and, you know, and then onto the next seat and then slide along again, like, you know, and...
The top surgery was much larger because in that top surgery, the medical aid in the earlier days had looked forward to providing flats so that when they engaged doctors in town, the doctors could be accommodated in the flats above that particular surgery. It was a very fine surgery, and again, it did such solid work in the town helping these people. But certainly they were looking very much ahead, very cleverly, I think, in making sure that if they had doctors, they could accommodate them on the site.
In 1919, Bevan won a scholarship to London's Central Labour College, but on returning 2 years later could not find work. For a year he would serve on the Medical Aid Committee and for several more on the hospital board. With socialist friends such as Archie Lush and Oliver Jones, he helped found the influential Query Club of politically like-minded individuals, one where Bevan's qualities made him natural leader. Realizing change could only come through power, this group helped Bevan's election to Tredegar Urban District Council in 1922, 2 years later as constituency party chairman, then county councillor, and finally MP. As worldwide depression deepened, unemployment soared and the town suffered badly. Calls for action were made nationwide from such as Bevan. "Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day," was the cry. In 1926, the Trades Union Council ordered a national general strike in support, and although this lasted only 8 days, miners continued the struggle for several months into 1927. As Michael Foot put it, "Hunger was the coal owners' weapon, and as long as the government permitted them, even assisted them, were resolved never to yield an inch." Bevan, then chairman of its combined lodges, became virtual leader of the town, heading its Council of Action, based in the Workman's Institute. Trees were felled across roads to prevent any coal leaving, feeding stations opened, and to keep up morale, choirs and jazz bands organized. Sports days were arranged, and largely because of Bevan's influence, no trouble occurred between strikers and police throughout the whole period. It seemed that town was as one. "I come from strong men," Bevan would proclaim. "My own men could stand until Christmas." All suggestions to link with communism were rejected. Bevan was not in sympathy with the prevailing belief that the USSR was a workers' paradise. Years later, after visiting that country, he would write with great perspicuity, "Whereas in Britain we were slaves to the past, in Russia they were slaves to the future." In 1928, Aneurin Bevan was elected as a Monmouthshire County Councillor, and in 1929, at 31 years of age, as Independent Labour MP for the Ebbw constituency. But hunger marches continued, unemployed miners tramping to more prosperous regions of England, singing on streets, collecting money as they went to keep their families fed.
Aneurin Bevan came to the Workman's Hall as a Labour minister and all that, and a huge crowd there supporting him. And a part of his speech was really speaking an attack on communists who Aneurin Bevan had spoke with on platforms asking for a second front during the war, and now he was a Labour minister. He began to attack communists, saying communists I've never done any good for the working class and all that sort of thing. And I had come back from Burma, and I had met several lads who were communists, and one in particular, a Scottish lad who had died out there. And I had to ask him the question. I said, well, Mr. Bevan, I said, you were attacking the communists. I said, would you say that Arthur Honor did nothing for the working class? And I'm afraid he got a bit up in the air about that, and he reviled me for supporting just one man, which was a real not the truth, because many communists were leading trades unions and that at that time, and did a lot for the working class.
Bevan's first attempt at seeking power was made in the town's urban district council that met in Bidwelty House. Bidwelty House was given to the town of Tredegar in 1901 by Lord Tredegar, and very shortly afterwards became the centre for the Tredegar Urban District Council. This is the Tredegar Council Chamber, and it was here in 1922 Aneurin Bevan was elected as a local councillor, and he took his seat here. And very shortly he realised, of course, the power didn't lie in these urban district councils. It lay down the road at Newport with the county council. And in 1928 he became elected as a county councillor, and then he realised, of course, they didn't really have the power he wanted to change the world. And so he stood and was elected as MP for the Ebervale constituency. Now with me is Dr. John Evans, who's Clerk of Tredegar Council. And I believe you can tell us something about Bevan in this room, John?
Indeed. Bevan was quite a fiery character. When he was initially elected, there were only 2 Labour members, and the rest of the council were mostly from people from the company men, mostly Liberals, and Bevan found it very difficult and frustrating to get anything through which was going to be changing the conditions of the workforce, particularly in this area. So Bevan then fought very hard locally and got other people to stand for the council. So that by the time of the next elections, instead of it being 2 Labour members, there were only 2 Liberals left.
Ah, yes.
And so Bevan then had all the power and control that he wanted. But then, of course, as you say, Peter, he then realised that the power wasn't here.
That's right.
So he then had to go down to Newport and try to change the world there. Same problem off to Westminster. And of course, as we know from Westminster, he actually did change so much, and to the benefit of everybody really, because the National Health Service is the model for the health services of many developed countries across the world.
Of course it is.
And it was the first and it was the best. And it is still the jewel in the crown of British society.
Yes. Do you know where he sat in this room, John?
Yes, Bevan sat in that chair there, second from our right as we're looking at it. That was his official seat.
Yes.
But when he wanted to attack the chairman of this Liberal-dominated council at the time, he would sit here where I am now. And harangue him across, because Bevan was very fond of the pointed finger, and he would harangue him across the bench. And of course Bevan, because he was Bevan, wouldn't stand up and accuse him as you were supposed to. According to the rules, you're supposed to stand and address the chair in a respectful fashion. Bevan would sit here and abuse him from his seated position. Very frustrating. Bevan had a very warm feel for Tredegar Urban District Council because, unlike the County Council, we actually lost his seat.
Yes.
He lost his seat on the County Council. He never lost his seat here. And even though he was a really powerful Member of Parliament, he still remembered that he was a Tredegar Town Councillor as well. And he maintained that for many years until, of course, he became a minister. It was just impossible to maintain his place here. And, of course, it was handed on to another Labour stalwart who then took over.
But you say, of course, that Bevan had always had this very close connection with the town of Tredegar where he was born.
Yes, the town where he was born, the town which gave him his life, his upbringing, and indeed his raison d'etre.
Oh,
Because
yes.
he saw what was happening. He didn't bury himself in a coal mine, which you had to work, but he also came out and looked at people around the streets and interacted with people.
Yes.
I think the Query Club was a wonderful opportunity to discuss and debate all sorts of subjects, and Bevan was part of the life of the town.
And did you ever meet Aneurin Bevan, John?
Yes, in 1959 I was helping the election, because I lived in Pontlot, which was outside the constituency, but I was helping in the election in Rugby, and I was marking off the numbers of people who had voted. And Bevan came in with this long coat down to his ankles, like a Russian guardsman's coat with Archie Lush's agent. And Bevan had his arms tucked back, with the coat tucked back in his arms. And said to me, "Boy, the numbers, boy, the numbers." And I, terrified by this incredible person, I showed him that the numbers where the register was being marked off. And he said, "Why haven't those people voted? Why haven't they voted, boy?" I said, "Some of them didn't work, Mr. Bevan. We'll be back and I'll be checking to make sure that they have voted." And then swept out with Archie Lush in tow. I was absolutely terrified. But he never came back.
One of the things about WWII House, of course, is that it represents both sides of the political spectrum. In the first instance, it was the home of an ironmaster who ruled this town, who ruled the company and the society. And it became home later to Tredegar Urban District Council, of which Bevan, of course, was a councillor. And he was the man who helped change and remold that society entirely. So, thank you very much, John, for allowing us to come in here and sharing your expertise with us about this man who certainly was a wonderful character. America's 1929 Wall Street crash triggered a world depression. Unemployment soared and wages fell. Against this background, Bevan's maiden speech in the House of Commons was a bombshell. Speaking in opposition to Winston Churchill, he established mutual respect between the two, with Churchill commenting, "Rarely do we hear such a debating speech nowadays." Bevan would say later, "I have known Winston Churchill for many years. Indeed, I was friendly with him when he was a bit of a naughty boy in the Tory party. But then, I'm a bit of a naughty boy myself. So there's a natural disposition for naughty boys to get together." The House of Commons would fill when either was due to speak, and Bevan became noted for brilliant oratory, often delivered in irreverent style. By 1931, he joined the Labour Party, and 3 years later married Jenny Lee, a Scots politician of left-wing views, but whose personal brilliance would henceforth be eclipsed by her more flamboyant husband. Problems arose particularly over his friendship with Lord Beaverbrook, the Conservative newspaper tycoon, who offered to pay for private medical treatment and even provide a house on his estate, although both were reluctantly refused. Bevan was enjoying a world far removed from that of Tredegar, dining in style at the Café Royal, mixing with the wealthy and powerful in a manner that led him to be called a Bollinger Bolshevik, a ritzy Robespierre, a lounge-suited Lenin. It was different in Tredegar, where feeding halls provided children with one hot meal a day, and most wore torn or patched clothes, or could be kept from school because their only pair of boots or shoes was being repaired. Illegal gambling had always taken place, but now the unemployed gathered on hillsides were more likely to be cutting prohibited coal to warm their homes than playing cards in the hope of winning a few pennies. As the years passed, a concerned government, fearful of revolution, seriously considered moving whole South Wales communities to the Usk Valley or coast, areas where employment might be found. King Edward VIII's visit to the coalfield gave rise to his significant comment, "Something must be done." But what could be done? Public works projects provided some small income for the unemployed, such as building Bedwellty Park swimming baths. Hunger marches continued, Oliver Powell, friend of Bevan and blacklisted by the company, recalled collapsing from hunger while trudging through a Buckinghamshire village, recovering to find someone pushing a 10-shilling note, then a considerable gift, into his pocket. Bevan did keep in regular touch with local supporters and attended rugby matches, where he was always happy to meet and chat with those around him. But tales of his changing into a worn and shabby suit upon reaching Abergavenny, or how he wined and dined with the wealthy, were widely circulated by his opponents. But those who came to listen at Wainapound or Tredegar's Workman's Hall would have none of it. Bevan was their man who would lead them out of all difficulties.
And in those days, Abervale had regular fixtures with a club called the Saracens. I can remember arriving at the ground at Southgate, and I can remember there was a commotion there. There was cameras everywhere. I remember looking out the window and seeing all these cameras and getting very excited. So as a young boy, I ran down to the front of the bus, and as soon as the bus opened, I was first off. And there was the great man himself, straight in front of me. And I can remember to this day, he patted me on the head, he shook hands with me, and he said, "Come up to enjoy the match, have you?" Said some words to that effect. I can't remember his exact words. And it was a fantastic aura about the place. The man had something really special. Also, which is significant, I suppose, as well, is that the reason why Aneurin Bevan was there was because he was president of the Abervale Club. But the president of the Saracens, who was also in attendance, was a gentleman called Ian MacLeod, who was a high-ranking Tory minister.
Matters began to improve for the town in 1938 when Richard Thomas's steelworks arrived in Abervale. And indeed, during the war that followed in 1939, now the town was prosperous again. Money was flowing through the local economy. Pits and factories were working flat out. One sign of the new feminine independence was the number of women going out to work wearing trousers that was a sign of their new liberty. The monkey parade along Commercial Street after chapel on Sunday nights now featured many uniforms. Home guards were practicing and rehearsing on the nearby hills against the anticipated arrival of German paratroopers. After America entered the war, long convoys of military lorries would roll down Sahowie Hill and up Charles Street, packed with soldiers going to some far-off invasion beach. The streets lined with children shouting, "Give us some gum, chum." And very often the men crouched in those lorries did just that. Although Bevan was Marxist in belief and instinctively pacifist, he supported the war because it was pro-Russia. But he opposed many of Winston Churchill's policies and made himself a great many enemies by so doing.
In the wartime, the council organised stay-at-home holidays, and they usually took place in the big field at the top of the park. And the stage was made of planks and oil drums, but it was very good because most of the local organisations took part. There was great audience participation, singing wartime songs, and it went up very well. Then another thing that happened in the war, where the betting office in the circle next to the library now, they'd opened the British restaurant where you could buy meals, help your mother's ration out. And it's surprising how many people talk about that now, the British restaurant.
Just the other day, a friend Ros was telling me that her father, who's now 82, was badly wounded in Egypt. He was serving as a soldier, and they're not certain if he was wounded by friendly or enemy fire, but he was quite ill. Uncle Nye somehow secured the finances to send Ros's grandfather out to Egypt to be with his son.
Well, during wartime, of course, we were all on rationing, and on rationing for many years after the war. During those years, sweets were rationed, the children shared if they could. There was not a lot, one didn't see fruit or bananas or anything like that. So we grew up in those years without all those so-called luxuries of today. And the main thing perhaps was what we call the monkey parade on a Sunday night, where all the young people walk from one end to the other and back again, where the occasional policeman might say, "Move along, please, don't stand talking."
I know on a Sunday evening it was a regular parade back in Port Town. I think they called it the monkey parade. And we'd walk back and forth, I suppose, about 20 or 30 times. And we used to end up probably in Rabiotti's cafe, you know, and have a cup of coffee and all that, and a talk and all that. But that was our Sunday night. And of course, I was in Tredegar in the early years of the war, but I joined the forces in 42. And as far as the blackout was concerned, you know, it used to be, well, I can't say we suffered a lot from it. We did have a blackout, but, you know, I can't remember, you know, being very perturbed about it at all. And I remember one night we had been over to Rugby, I think, to a dance. And we walking over Kevangola, over the road, coming up from Rugby. And we were challenged by the Home Guard. And of course we gave the answer, like, you know, and we didn't say friend or anything. We said, well, so and so and so. And they said, oh, all right, come on, Bert, you can come. It's all right, I know you.
One of Tredegar's surgeries stood in Park Place, through which this band is shown marching in the late 1930s. It was in 1942, just a few years later, during Churchill's wartime government, that the Beveridge report suggested the establishment of a British National Health Service. But that was not implemented until 1945 in the election of a Labour government. The choice of Aneurin Bevan as Minister of Health was inspired because he was a man who understood how bad housing had affected much of the illness of Tredegar, and indeed how important the Tredegar Medical Aid Service had been in combating those diseases. Sir George Godber, a member of the Planning Committee, claimed that progress only really began when Bevan became minister. Bevan, he said, clearly stated the NHS must be for everybody. It must be funded from taxation, must take over the hospitals that are not run for profit and set up an integrated system, and there must be an end to the sale and purchase of medical practice. Bevan's natural charm will overcome opposition. Speaking to doctors, Bevan said, I consider myself a doctor. I have a therapy. That's the right word, isn't it? I believe it the function of the Ministry of Health to provide the most modern apparatus for doctors for the treatment of the people of this country. The new NHS had little immediate impact upon the town. There was already a fine hospital, good surgeries like the one behind me, and a system of doctors and medical practice. And yet, tales abounded of abuse of the new system, as is often the case when anything is considered a right and seemingly free. There were tales of cotton wool being used to stuff cushions, or surgical gauze being employed as window net, or that wonderful story of a convict who applied for one of the free National Health wigs and used it to escape unrecognised. But demand and cost rose steadily. And in 1951, when a new Labour government proposed introducing charges for teeth and spectacles, Bevan, then Minister of Labour, resigned in protest, becoming leader of the Bevanite faction. But this faded 5 years later when he re-entered the Labour fold, and his attempt to become party leader was defeated by Hugh Gaitskell. On becoming Shadow Foreign Secretary, to the fury of many in the party, he opposed their desired unilateral nuclear disarmament with a common sense observation: you cannot go naked into the conference chamber. A convenient central location where Bevan would often address constituents was Wainer Pound Sahawi, where his words could enthrall all who came to listen. The Aneurin Bevan Memorial, At Pound on the ridge between Sahawi and Ebbo valleys, a very convenient place for people from Rumney, from Tredegar, from Ebbowvale to walk to these massive meetings, these crowds of people who have come here to listen to this wonderful man, to this tremendous speaker. And you can almost see him when you're standing here, leaning forward, pointing to the crowds with that slightly high-pitched voice of his. Because Bevan, you see, this Valleys man, this man who had been a miner, who had been a councillor, who had been an MP, had now become a great politician, a world-renowned politician. And here, as the plaque behind me says, this man spoke to his constituents and indeed to the world. Standing here with the stone representing Bevan behind me and the other stones of the three parts of his constituency scattered around, it's easy to sense how electric those moments must have been. This wonderful time when people came from everywhere to listen to this man. You can see him here, you can sense him on this place, this one place so closely connected with the man, where he's speaking to the crowd, urging, whipping up their excitement, telling them why they must follow his policies, why what he is doing is correct. This is an amazing place in which, again, where the spirit of Bevan seems to prevail. Of course, the colliers and steel workers that Aneurin Bevan addressed at this place have gone. The industries have vanished. No longer are there turning pit wheels or belching stacks coming from the steelworks down below. So instead we have a green area, the beginning, in fact, of the Sahawi Valley Walk that runs all the way down the ridge between the Sahawi and Ebbowvale valleys. But this is still an exciting and evocative place where it is so very easy to conjure up the spirit of the past.
I can remember going up to the Whit Pound and listening to one of his speeches, and it was absolutely electric. You'd stand on the mountain and you'd look down the valley towards the Tredegar end and you'd see droves of people coming up the hill. You look the other way and you've seen them all coming from the Ebbowvale area and all converging on the Whit Pound area. And it was absolutely magnetic.
We heard that the Aneurin Bevan would be holding a rally up on top of Whit Pound. So we weren't all that old, so we went up there for nose around. And J.C. Charles had a van with loudspeakers on the top, which could be taken off and twisted around whichever way you wanted the sound to go. So we go there, and one thing about it, when Aneurin Bevan was started, you could hear a pin drop.
As soon as the man spoke, there was a hush, went over the whole crowd. You could hear every sentence that he said, and he had this strange, high-pitched voice. Everything would go quiet until he finished, and then everybody broke into raptures.
That celebrated stance, the pointing finger, so often seen at Whit Pound, feature in a painting by a Tredegar artist. Malcolm Williams's dramatic portrayal of Aneurin Bevan and the places that featured in his life has been presented at Blaenau Gwent County Borough for permanent display. I'm with Malcolm Williams, artist of Tredegar, who's painted this very fine representation of Aneurin Bevan with all the elements, or some of the elements, of Bevan's life in the background on the canvas. What inspired you to do this particularly, Malcolm?
Well, Aneurin Bevan being a Tredegar boy, and obviously his life story basically gone from a child as a miner through the mining industry. Then he became obviously one of the miners' leaders at the time. He inspired himself from there to be the MP for the Tredegar area and Ebbowvale area, which I've depicted basically in the painting, such as the miners underground and the pit head bars, and in the background is the RDBs as it was, and obviously around then to the Big Ben. And obviously where I got him situated is like on top of Sahawi Hill there, where he did a lot of his publicising and public speaking. And obviously the town clock has been 150 years this year, and also the Medical Aid Centre, which obviously is the National Health, where it started off in the beginning. medical aid centre, that's what he was inspired from to create the National Health Service, which is obviously 60-year-old.
And how long did it take you to paint, Morgan?
Well, it took me about a month to get things sorted out where I wanted to actually put the various things in his position and everything else, and which I did some drawings of and some experiments throughout for about a month. And then I started then and put it onto canvas, which took me then at least another month to do and to finish.
Well, I think it's a wonderful gift to the borough, of course, of which Tredegar is now part, and a wonderful acquisition for the social history and heritage of this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Both infuriating and inspiring, Aneurin Bevan was one of the most remarkable and significant individuals these valleys have produced, one who left his mark upon British and world history. Until the very end of his life, this area remained his true home.
I can remember 1960 when he died, and my grandmother was ill just then, and so I went in her place to the memorial service at Westminster Abbey. We travelled up on the train, and in the carriage was my mother Edith, my aunt Peggy, Uncle Billy, his twin sons Billy and young Nye, and Billy Harry was a local councillor. I remember the discussion on the train was wonderful, everyone telling their stories about Nye and how they remembered him. And of course they were all dressed in funeral black. I was dressed in cream from my head to my feet because Nye didn't think that young people should wear black. He didn't agree either with the thought of flowers being wired for wreaths. And so when my grandmother and my mother died, they just had a spray of simple flowers, no wreaths. So his influence continued from one generation to the other.
I was about 16, I think, when I attended his memorial service. I can remember the pictures of him being ill in hospital, and it just wasn't the Nye Bevan that I knew. It wasn't the electric person that I can remember speaking from the mountaintop. But what impressed me that day was the composure of Jenny Lee. And I think everybody there felt so sorry for her. But in her own right, she was dynamic in the way she spoke to the crowd, and it was really very, very emotional, a very emotional day. And I can remember the Reverend Soper standing up and introducing her, and this almost like Joan of Arc figure stood up. And the eulogy that she gave to her husband that day, again, will stay with me forever. You know, it was obvious that they were soulmates in the real sense of the word. They weren't just husband and wife, they were soulmates. And that came through very, very strongly.
Aneurin Bevan died of cancer in 1960 at the age of 63. It was a tragic loss for both country and for Parliament because rarely had any MP brought such energy and intellect to the House of Commons. Relationship with his Labour Party had sometimes not been too easy when he objected to what he believed were anti-socialist policies and efforts against his innate beliefs. Yet, he was bitterly disappointed when his party lost 3 general elections in a row. This truly remarkable man would die after a major operation, but would not be buried near his Buckinghamshire Ashridge farm home. It was near here on the hills overlooking the Dyffryn-Cronan Valley that Aneurin Bevan's ashes would be scattered. There's a story, possibly true, that the car bringing his remains back from the crematorium would be stolen, but was later recovered with its contents intact. In great sadness, his lifelong friend and local agent Archie Lush, then Sir Archie Lush, scattered Bevan's ashes beneath a tree where they'd once sat and looked at the surrounding countryside and discussed all the political problems of the day. As the mountain winds began to blow Bevan's ashes over the surrounding hills and valleys, it seemed a fitting end for one who had once said, "Where is the port to which the ship would go? Far, far away is all the sailor knows."